By most brand valuations, the company is worth around $18 billion. It has never gone bankrupt. It has never been broken up. It is more valuable now than at any point in its history. And the family whose name is on the door does not own one share of it. Not one. They were not beaten by a rival. They were not wiped out in a crash. The business they built kept working. It simply stopped being theirs. How does that happen? To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was made. And by whom. Guccio Gucci was born in Florence in 1881. His father worked in leather goods, respectable trade, small margins, no future worth waiting for. Guccio understood that early, and as a teenager he did what ambitious poor young men from Tuscany did in that era. He left. He went to London. And in London he found work at the Savoy Hotel. Not as a manager, not as a clerk, as a lift operator and a luggage porter. This is the detail that reframes everything that follows. The most recognizable Italian luxury house in the world was not conceived in Florence, or Milan, or Rome. It began in the service corridors of an English hotel, in the hands of a teenager carrying other people's suitcases up other people's stairs. Because Guccio was not simply carrying them, he was reading them. The Savoy at the turn of the century served the wealthiest travelers on earth: English aristocracy, American industrialists, European royalty. They arrived with trunks and cases built by the finest craftsmen in Europe, and Guccio handled every one of them. He learned the stitching. He learned the hardware, the hinges, the linings. He learned which pieces the truly rich chose when they had every option available to them. And he learned something more useful than any of that. He learned that luggage was never about luggage. A case announced who you were before you spoke. It was a signal, and signals could be manufactured. He returned to Italy in 1902 and took a job with Franzi, one of the country's established leather goods manufacturers. He spent the better part of 2 decades there, learning the trade properly from the inside. Materials, tanning, production, cost. By the time he opened his own door, he had spent 20 years preparing for it. In 1921, Guccio Gucci opened a small shop on the Via della Vigna Nuova in Florence. At first he sold imported leather goods, mostly English. The same kind of pieces he had spent years handling at the Savoy. But Florence had something London did not: centuries of leather craft and craftsmen who could be hired. So he stopped importing and started making. The workshop built saddlery, luggage, gloves, and handbags. The equestrian details that would later define the brand, the buckles, the straps, the horse-bit motif, did not come from a design studio. They came from the actual saddle trade, because that was genuinely part of what the workshop made. Then came the shortages, and with them the accidents that made Gucci iconic. In 1935, after Italy invaded Abyssinia, the League of Nations imposed economic sanctions. Raw materials became difficult and then impossible to obtain, and the war that followed made it worse. Leather became scarce across the country. Guccio could not source enough of it to keep production running. Most workshops in that position reduced output or closed. His craftsmen substituted instead. They wove canvas from hemp. They used pigskin, and later raffia and linen. They took the striped webbing that would become one of the most recognizable design signatures on earth directly from the girth strap of a horse's saddle, because it was already sitting there in the workshop. And in 1947, working in the same spirit of improvisation, they heated bamboo over an open flame and bent it into a curved handle, because they could not get the leather to make a conventional one. The bamboo bag became one of the most copied objects in the history of fashion. None of it was a vision. All of it was substitution. Decisions made by men who could not get the material they wanted. The business survived the war and expanded. A store opened on the Via Condotti in Rome. Another opened in Milan. And in 1953, Aldo Gucci opened the first American store in New York on East 58th Street. The store was located inside a hotel. The hotel was called the Savoy Plaza. 50 years after a Tuscan teenager carried luggage through the service corridors of the Savoy in London, his family's name went up inside a hotel that carried the same name, on the other side of the Atlantic. Nobody planned that. It simply happened. That same year, the workshop produced a loafer with a metal horse bit across the front. In 1985, that shoe would enter the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Guccio Gucci saw the New York store open. He died 15 days later in Milan, just short of his 72nd birthday. And here is where the story of the fortune actually begins, not with how it was built, but with how it was divided. The company went to his sons, Aldo, Vasco, and Rodolfo, in equal shares. He also had a daughter. Grimalda had worked in the business for years. He left her nothing. She sued for a share and lost. The precedent that established was not lost on anyone in the family. At Gucci, ownership was a bloodline argument, and bloodline arguments were settled in court. It would not be the last time. Aldo was the one who understood what his father had really built. Not a leather workshop, a symbol. And symbols scale in a way workshops do not. Through the 1950s, 60s and 70s, Aldo drove Gucci into the American market with a ferocity none of his brothers matched. New York, Chicago, Palm Beach, Beverly Hills. Rodolfo had taken a different route entirely, and this is the second thing about the Gucci family that almost nobody knows. Before he ran a luxury house, Rodolfo Gucci was a film actor. He worked in Italian cinema through the 1930s under the stage name Maurizio D'Ancora. He married an actress, Sandra Ravel. And when he had a son, he named the boy after the character name he had used on screen. That son was Maurizio Gucci. Remember him. Through the 1960s, Gucci stopped being a brand and became a cultural object. The horsebit loafer crossed classes in a way almost no product does. Equally at home on an Italian aristocrat and an American corporate lawyer, Grace Kelly was given a floral scarf designed specifically for her, and it became the Flora print. Peter Sellers, Audrey Hepburn, and Elizabeth Taylor all carried Gucci pieces in public. And then came the bag. In 1961, Gucci released a soft shoulder bag with a curved profile. It was catalogued, unromantically, as the 50s bag. Shortly afterwards, photographers began capturing Jacqueline Kennedy carrying one. Repeatedly, in public. As First Lady of the United States, and later as one of the most photographed women alive. There was no endorsement deal, no fee was paid, no permission was sought from anyone in the Kennedy household. Gucci simply began calling it the Jackie bag and waited to see whether anyone would object. Nobody did. The bag is still sold under that name today. By the 1970s, Gucci was operating across Europe, North America, Asia, and the Middle East. And the family lived accordingly. There were villas in Tuscany and apartments in Rome. There was a chalet in St. Moritz. There was a penthouse in the Olympic Tower on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, which Rodolfo gave to his son. And later, there would be the Creole. The Creole is a 3-masted schooner built in England in 1927 and one of the largest wooden sailing yachts ever constructed. She had passed through several owners and been requisitioned by the British Navy during the war. By the 1980s, she was in poor condition. Maurizio Gucci bought her and committed to a full restoration, a project that ran for years and consumed an amount of money that has never been publicly confirmed, but which people close to him described as extraordinary, even by the standards of extraordinary wealth. Hold on to that. It matters later. Because while the money was flowing in, the family made the decision that hollowed the entire thing out. There was a faster way to make money than selling handbags, and Aldo found it. Licensing. If someone else manufactured the product and Gucci simply lent the name, Gucci collected a fee with no factory, no craftsman, no inventory, and almost no cost. It was close to free money, and Aldo turned the tap as far as it would go. By the mid-1980s, the Gucci name was attached to more than 22,000 separate products. 22,000. Lighters, ashtrays, playing cards, umbrellas, keyrings, whiskey, products with no connection whatsoever to the craft tradition Guccio had spent 30 years building, carrying a name that had been earned in that tradition and was now being rented out by the unit. Counterfeit Gucci goods were being sold openly on the street, and the counterfeits were often difficult to distinguish from the licensed originals, because at that volume there was not much meaningful difference left. The revenue was real. The money arrived every quarter. And the thing that made the name valuable in the first place was being consumed in order to produce it. The family did not see a problem. They were, by that point, entirely occupied with something else. They were at war with each other. The structure Guccio left behind required his sons to agree. They did not. Aldo held one branch. Rodolfo held another. Vasco died in 1974 without children, and his share passed to his brothers. Cousins grew up inside a company where every relative was a rival shareholder, and every family dinner had a balance sheet underneath it. Meetings turned into arguments. Arguments turned into lawsuits. By the late 1970s, the Guccis were suing each other routinely in multiple countries over trademarks, dividends, and control. And then there was Paolo. Paolo Gucci was Aldo's son, a designer by inclination, combative by temperament, and completely convinced that the family was suppressing him. He wanted his own line. He wanted to put his own name on it. His name happened to be Gucci. The family refused. Paolo pushed anyway. They sued him to stop him using his own surname commercially, and eventually stripped him of his positions. In 1982, at a board meeting, the argument turned physical. Paolo had attempted to tape the proceedings. The meeting broke down. Paolo left with blood on his face, and photographs were taken. He filed charges against his father, his brother, and his cousin over the beating he said he had received. And then he did something considerably more damaging than any lawsuit. Paolo Gucci took what he knew about his family's finances, the offshore companies, the routing of royalty payments, the structures built to keep money out of reach of tax authorities, and handed the documents to the United States government. His father was in his 80s. The case that followed charged Aldo Gucci with evading roughly $7 million in United States taxes. In 1986, at 81 years of age, Aldo Gucci pleaded guilty in a federal court in New York. He was sentenced to a year and a day. The man who built Gucci in America went to an American prison, put there by documents supplied by his own son. And it gets worse. Rodolfo had died in 1983, leaving his entire 50% stake to his only child. Maurizio Gucci was now the largest single shareholder in the company, and almost immediately, prosecutors came for him too. Transferring a 50% holding in Gucci from a dead father to a living son triggered an enormous inheritance tax liability in Italy. Investigators alleged that the share transfer documents had been signed after Rodolfo's death, with his signature forged in order to make the transfer appear to have happened while he was alive and to avoid the tax. Aldo, locked in a control battle with his nephew, made sure the authorities had what they needed. In 1986, facing an arrest warrant, Maurizio Gucci fled Italy. He crossed into Switzerland and stayed there, running the company he owned half of from outside the country that wanted to charge him. He was later cleared. But look at what that period actually cost. In the same stretch of years, one of the two men who controlled Gucci was a fugitive in Switzerland, and the other was in a federal prison in the United States, each of them pursued by tax authorities on evidence handed over by a member of their own family. And while that was happening, somebody had been watching. Investcorp was a Bahrain-based investment firm with a specific appetite, powerful brands, trapped under dysfunctional ownership. They had bought Tiffany & Company in the early 1980s, restructured it, and taken it public at a substantial profit. They knew exactly what they were looking at. Gucci, by the mid-1980s, was that in its purest form. Investcorp began buying. They did not launch a takeover. They did not make an offer to the company. They went to individual family members, the branches short of cash, buried in legal fees or simply exhausted, and bought their shares quietly, one holding at a time. Aldo's sons sold. Other relatives sold. Each seller was solving their own immediate problem. None of them was looking at the aggregate. By the end of the decade, Investcorp held roughly half of Gucci. The other half belonged to Maurizio. And here is the part of the story that is genuinely difficult. Because Maurizio was right. He looked at the 22,000 licenses and understood that his family had spent 30 years selling the brand's future in order to fund its present. He began cancelling licensing agreements. He cut product lines. He brought in Dawn Mello from Bergdorf Goodman to rebuild the design direction. He set out to make Gucci a genuine luxury house again, rather than a name printed on ashtrays. The strategy was correct. It is, in outline, the strategy that produced the company that exists today. But cancelling licenses means cancelling income. Revenue fell before the repositioning could take hold. Maurizio was also spending heavily on new headquarters, on new stores, on a rebuild that assumed the money would keep arriving. And this is where the schooner comes back. The restoration of the Creole ran alongside the collapse in Gucci's revenues. Properties were mortgaged. Loans were taken against the shareholding itself. In 1993, Gucci lost more than $20 million on revenues of around $230 million. Trade creditors were at the door. There were payrolls the company struggled to meet. The relationship with Investcorp broke down completely. They wanted the losses stopped. He wanted more time. There were deadlocked board meetings, competing valuations, and a fight over whether he could be removed. At one point he came close to losing his stake outright to the banks because he had pledged it as collateral. He could not raise the capital to buy Investcorp out. They would not fund a plan they had lost confidence in. By 1993, Maurizio Gucci was out of money and out of room. Investcorp made an offer for his half of the company. He took it. The reported figure was around $170 million. The papers were signed. The transfer cleared. And in that moment, no bankruptcy, no takeover battle, nothing visible from the street. The Gucci family stopped owning Gucci. Investcorp had now bought the entire company. According to the figures later filed with regulators, the total cost of that 100% stake was around $246 million. 2 years later, they would take Gucci public. Their eventual return on the whole investment ran into the billions. After the sale, Maurizio moved through Milan with money in the bank and no company to run. He took an apartment near the center. He talked about new ventures. By most accounts he was, for the first time in a long while, at ease. He had also, years earlier, left his wife. Patrizia Reggiani had married Maurizio in 1972 over his father's explicit objection. Rodolfo had judged her an opportunist and did not attend the wedding. They had 2 daughters, Alessandra and Allegra. In 1985, Maurizio told Patrizia he was leaving on a short business trip. He did not come back. The separation ran for years. The divorce was not finalized until 1994. Patrizia did not accept the ending. She had built an identity around the Gucci name, the apartments, the position, the recognition, and the settlement, in her view, did not compensate for the loss of it. People who knew her described a woman who did not move through grievance so much as circle it. She grew close to a woman named Pina Oriema, who worked as a clairvoyant. Over months and then years, the conversation between them turned from grievance to intention. On the morning of the 27th of March, 1995, Maurizio Gucci walked towards the entrance of his office building on the Via Palestro in Milan. It was just before 9. He had no security and no reason to expect any. A man was waiting at the foot of the steps. He fired 3 times into Maurizio's back, then once more. Maurizio Gucci died in the doorway of his own office, at 46 years old. There was one other person there. Giuseppe Onorato, the building's porter, had heard the shots and come forward. The gunman shot him too, on his way out. Onorato survived. For years afterwards he spoke about what he had seen. A working man who happened to be at the door of the wrong building on the wrong morning, and who carried it long after the headlines moved on. The investigation then ran cold for 2 years. There was no shortage of theories. Maurizio had been in business disputes. He had made enemies in boardrooms. He had sold a company for a great deal of money, and there were people who felt entitled to some of it. Milan police worked through the possibilities and arrived nowhere. It broke in 1997 when an informant came forward with an account of who had arranged it. The chain ran from a getaway driver named Orazio Cicala to a gunman named Benedetto Ceraulo and back through Pina Oriema to Patrizia Reggiani. At trial, prosecutors established the contract price, roughly 600 million lire, somewhere in the region of $370,000 at the time. That was the sum required to end the last Gucci to run Gucci. Patrizia Reggiani was convicted of ordering the murder and sentenced to 29 years, later reduced. She served 18 and was released in 2016. During her sentence, she was reportedly offered the chance to leave prison early on a work release arrangement and reportedly declined it, on the grounds that she had never worked in her life and did not intend to start. There is a further detail, widely repeated, that investigators found the date of the murder marked in advance in her private diary. That comes through press reporting rather than court record, and it should be held loosely. What is not in dispute is the conviction, the sentence, and the price. 7 months after the murder, Gucci went public. Domenico De Sole took over as chief executive. A young American designer named Tom Ford took over the collections. Between them, they finished what Maurizio had started. The licenses stayed cancelled, the product line stayed cut, and the brand was rebuilt into one of the most commercially dominant houses in the world. In 1999, after a takeover fight, the French group that would become Kering took a controlling position. Every part of that was done by people with no blood relationship to the name on the building. There is no Gucci on the board today. There is no Gucci in the design studio. The value sitting in that brand belongs entirely to shareholders in Paris. Maurizio's daughters, Alessandra and Allegra, inherited what remained of his personal estate. A substantial private fortune, and no company. Their father had been murdered. Their mother had ordered it. Alessandra was 18. Allegra was 14. The Creole passed to them as well. It still sails. The family did not lose Gucci in a single catastrophic decision. That is what makes this story worth telling. There was no crash to blame. No rival that beat them. No market that turned against them. The business worked. It never stopped working. They lost it in fragments, in a daughter written out of a will, in a license signed for quick money, in a lawsuit filed against a cousin, in documents handed to a prosecutor, in a share sold quietly to solve one bad year. Guccio Gucci learned in a London hotel that a name is a signal. His descendants learned that a signal can be sold. Neither generation seems to have worked out that it can only be sold once. The Vanderbilts made the same discovery in a different country and a different century, with a larger fortune and an emptier ending. That story is next.